Tonight, the world grows quiet. The noise of the day fades, and the old stories begin to breathe again. Welcome to Narrative Nights, a place where ancient myths are not told in haste, but allowed to unfold slowly, like dreams remembered in the dark. Here, we walk beside forgotten gods, cross mist-covered shores, and listen to the wisdom carried through time, softly, gently, without urgency. There is nothing you need to learn, nothing you need to follow. Only listen. Let your thoughts grow still, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to carry you between waking and sleep. Now, the fire burns low, the night deepens, and the story begins. Some of the loveliest sounds in Irish folklore were also the most dangerous, for there was music, people said, that could lure a listener away from the road and into the hidden world. The hills were silver before they were dark. Under the moon, the Irish fields seemed to loosen from the day and become something older, softer, less certain in their boundaries. Stone walls wandered pale across the land, and the road home, so plain in sunlight, now curved through mist as if it had forgotten where it meant to lead. Here and there a thorn tree stood alone, holding its own shadow close. Nothing in that landscape looked empty. Even in stillness it felt inhabited by a patience that belonged to the night itself. And then, so lightly that it might first be mistaken for wind passing through grass, came the music. Not near enough to startle, not clear enough to be named, it drifted in and out across the moonlit hills as though it had no fixed source at all. A few notes only, thin and bright, then gone. Then a faint threading of sound again, carried over the fields and through the mist, too delicate for any ordinary gathering and too lonely for a house of celebration. It did not break the silence. It entered it, as though it had always been hidden there, waiting for the hour when the roads emptied and the night began to listen. In such moments the old warning returned before any prayer did. Do not follow music heard at night. Do not leave the road home for a song you cannot place. Do not turn aside because something beautiful calls from the hill, or from the hollow beyond the hedge, or from the dark edge of a field where no house stands. These cautions survived in rural Ireland not as loud commands, but as inherited wisdom, spoken quietly and remembered easily. For some sounds, people believed, were invitations disguised as melodies, and not every invitation was meant for human feet. It was said that certain music did not belong to human hands at all. No fiddler in a cottage, no piper on the road, no harpist seated in candlelight could fully account for it. This was music thought to come from the hidden places folded into the Irish landscape, from the folk who lived just beyond sight, from a country that ran beside the human one and touched it only in glancing ways. In old belief, the night was not empty air between sunset and dawn. It was a thinner border, and through that border sometimes came sound, so lovely and so finely made that it seemed less performed than breathed into the world by something ancient, watchful, and entirely unlike us. What made such music dangerous was not ugliness, but beauty. It did not threaten, it enticed. It arrived with a sweetness that seemed almost merciful, touching the listener not with terror but with longing. The tune might seem to promise rest to the weary, company to the lonely, or some forgotten happiness just beyond the next rise. Yet this was the heart of the old taboo. What lures most powerfully is often what appears most gentle. The beauty itself was the snare. To hear it and remain where one stood, to let the music pass over without stepping toward it, required a kind of discipline that old stories admired and doubted in equal measure. For the sound was rarely imagined as coming from the road itself. It drifted from the places just beyond it, from the slope no cart took after dark, From the ring of grass no animal grazed, from the hill fort dim under the moon, from the wrath half swallowed by earth. Ireland's hidden places were not always grand. Often they were near at hand, a mound in a field, a bend in the river, a hollow where fog gathered after the rest of the land had cleared. By daylight they could seem merely old, merely local, merely part of the view. But at night, with distant music moving over them, they became thresholds. And the traveller who left the road home to seek the source of the song might discover, too late, that even a short step across wet grass could become a crossing into somewhere not meant for the living. Still, the first feeling in these stories was not dread. It was wonder, the sense that the world might be wider than daylight allowed, and more enchanted than ordinary caution could admit. To hear a tune with no visible maker was to feel, for a moment, that the land remembered secrets older than the roads and older than the names people gave the hills. That is what gave the old warnings their strange tenderness. They did not forbid wonder. They only asked that wonder remain unchaste, that admiration stop short of surrender, that the listener keep one foot on the known path even while the heart leaned toward the dark. So the night in Ireland came to hold two truths at once, that music on the wind could feel like a blessing, and that its loveliness might ask for too much in return. The moonlit hills shone quietly. Mist gathered in the low places. The road home waited in pale silence, plain and faithful beneath the stars. And somewhere beyond the hedges, beyond the last gate, beyond the fields where the human world felt safest, the distant music seemed to turn once more and drift onward, as if inviting any listening soul to wonder who or what still sang in the hidden places just out of sight. By day, the countryside of Old Ireland seemed a place of known measures. A man could name the fields he crossed, count the gates, tell where the lane bent around a stand of ash, and judge by the shape of a distant hill how long it would be before he saw his own door again. The land was worked, remembered, and spoken for. Cattle moved through it, carts cut their ruts into it, and each patch of ground belonged to some habit of use or some story of inheritance. But night did not simply cover that familiar world. It altered it. Under moonlight, distances seemed to loosen. The whitewashed wall that marked a boundary by day became a pale line with no certain end. A stream became a ribbon of shifting silver. Mist gathered over the low fields and softened every edge, until even the most ordinary path seemed to pass not only through the countryside, but through some gentler and more uncertain version of it. In folklore this mattered. Darkness was not only the absence of light, it was a change in the condition of things, a quiet turning of the world into something less settled and more open to meanings that daylight kept firmly in place. It was often the roads that changed first. Lanes that had been simple under the sun grew strange after dusk, as if they no longer served only the business of travel, but remembered older errands. The road home, reliable in daylight, now ran narrow between hedges that leaned inward, and every gate seemed to keep its own silence. A gate left half open could look less like carelessness than invitation. A stile beside a field could appear to offer a crossing into ground one had no business entering after dark, and the fields themselves, so practical by morning, became stretches of dim silver and shadow, where the furrows no longer guided the eye. A traveller might know perfectly well which farm lay beyond a wall, which pasture sloped toward the stream, which lane reached the village at last, and still feel, for no reason he could fully name, that a few wrong steps in moonlight might place him somewhere he'd never meant to go. Such uncertainty did not always come from being lost in the ordinary sense. In old belief, one could know the land very well, and yet still be led astray when the hour itself had changed the rules. The hills deepened that feeling. In daylight they rose as landmarks, broad-backed and familiar. But by night they seemed to watch more than merely stand. Their shapes gathered authority under the moon, and the old mounds and ring forts half hidden in their folds became impossible to dismiss as accidents of earth. Trees changed as well, especially the solitary ones. The thorn at the field's edge, the ash leaning over a well, the dark cluster of elder near a ruin. These were not always feared, but they were noticed. Their stillness looked deliberate. Their shadows seemed to keep their own counsel. A grassy mound that passed without notice at noon could, by moonlight, feel curiously inhabited, not because anything moved upon it, but because it held itself apart from the rest of the field, self-contained and patient. Folk tradition returned again and again to such places, not grand wilderness, but small elevations, ancient embankments, and lone trees standing where roads bent or fields met. These were the features that invited a second glance after dark, and in that second glance the land ceased to be only land. It became presence. Night, then, did not merely surround belief, it stirred it. The old caution woven through Irish folklore belonged to those hours when sight was partial and certainty less firm. People knew that darkness enlarged the imagination, yet they did not think imagination alone explained everything. Evening prayers, careful routes, blessings spoken before setting out or returning late. These were not theatrical gestures for a frightening world, but modest acts of respect toward one that might hold more than human life. One did not need to be wild with superstition to feel this. Even a practical mind could admit that some hours made the heart more receptive, and that what seemed laughable at noon could seem quietly possible at midnight. That is why so many inherited warnings were tied not simply to places, but to times. Do not cross certain ground after dark. Do not linger at a fairy fort by moonlight. Do not sleep beside a lone thorn. Do not answer when a voice comes from outside too late to belong to any neighbour. The caution was temporal as much as spatial. The land had not vanished. It had shifted into a state in which old boundaries were thought to grow thin, and when boundaries thinned, ordinary places were allowed to become threshold places. A ford in the river was no longer only the shallow crossing everyone used, but a place where one world might brush another. A ring of grass in a field was no longer only a quirk of growth, but the mark of hidden dancing. A hollow where mist pooled beneath the hills could seem to gather not only damp air, but a silence too dense to be empty. Even the edges of settlements, the last cottage, the final gate, the point where cultivated land gave way to rougher ground, carried a peculiar charge. Thresholds mattered because they were already places of passing between states, and folklore has always loved such edges. Doorways, shorelines, crossroads, twilight, the moment before sleep. The countryside after dark was filled with them. It asked the traveller to consider that he was not moving only through space, but through older boundaries best left undisturbed, through visible geography and invisible custom. What looked like hesitation on a lonely lane might, in that older imagination, be the instinctive recognition that one had come near a seam in the world. Yet darkness in these stories did not mean vacancy. This is one of the most important differences between a modern fear of the night and the older sense that clung to rural places. The dark was not a blank. It was inhabited in ways that could not be neatly counted. There were the ordinary signs of life, of course. The distant bark of a dog, the stir of cattle, the sudden flight of a bird disturbed in a hedge. But around and beyond those things lay the possibility of other presences, not always hostile, not always visible, and not always eager to be understood. A field could feel occupied without showing any figure at all. A stand of trees could seem to hold an attention rather than a shape. A person walking late might feel less that he was alone than that he had entered a domain where human company was no longer the only kind that mattered. In that sense, Old Ireland after dark was spiritually crowded, though softly so. It did not announce itself with spectacle. It suggested, it hinted, it pressed upon the senses with a quiet uncertainty that made people more careful, more reverent, and more willing to leave certain mysteries untested. This is why the folklore of the night feels so persuasive when it speaks of hidden things stirring. The landscape itself had already prepared the mind. Roads no longer felt entirely trustworthy. Gates and fields invited uncertainty. Hills and trees held their watch. Thresholds multiplied wherever mist blurred one place into another. A person moving through such a countryside did not need to see a fairy host pass over the ridge to believe that the ordinary world had become porous for a few hours. It was enough that the land itself seemed to breathe differently. It was enough that familiar things stood in altered relation to one another, and that the heart, listening to the hush between sounds, could imagine life moving just beyond the reach of sight. In such an hour, belief did not arrive as doctrine. It arrived as atmosphere confirmed by custom, as a feeling shaped by generations who had walked the same roads and chosen, prudently, not to dismiss what the night seemed to imply. And once the countryside had changed in this way, once road, field, mound, and tree had all become capable of more than their daylight meanings, it was easier to understand how certain sounds might belong to the altered night, as naturally as mist belonged to the low ground. For if places could become thresholds, then perhaps they could also become instruments, carrying across the hills some note not meant for daytime ears. And so, in the hush of Old Ireland after dark, when the land felt nearest to its hidden life, the listener was prepared for what might drift next through that deepened world. Not speech, not wind alone, but music. What then did people mean when they spoke of fairy music? Not merely a pleasing tune heard in the distance, and not every melody that arrived strangely through the dark. They meant a kind of sound that seemed to stand just outside the ordinary human order of things, music with no visible player, no hearth to anchor it, no door flung open on light and company. It belonged to the same world of old warnings as the moonlit road, the mist-filled hollow, the hill that seemed to hold its breath after sunset. Yet of all the signs that another realm might lie close beside the human one, this was among the gentlest and most persuasive. It did not announce itself with terror. It appeared as beauty heard where beauty should not reasonably have been, and for that very reason it was remembered with such care. Human music was known by its warmth and its setting. It came from cottages where voices rose together after the work was done, from weddings and wakes, from harvest suppers, from fiddles drawn close to the fire and songs passed around a table, while night pressed softly at the window. Even when heard at a distance, village music carried the marks of the world that made it. One could imagine the room, the company, the stamping of feet on the floorboards, the laughter between verses, the pause while someone filled a cup or tuned a string. Household singing belonged to breath, body, and fellowship. It was earthly in the best sense, woven into labour, memory, celebration, and grief. Fairy music, by contrast, seemed cut loose from all such signs. It did not arrive with the murmur of voices or the rough cheer of festivity, or no window shone where it came from, no figure stood in a doorway. It seemed to have slipped free of human circumstance, carrying melody without the visible life that should have surrounded it. Those who tried to describe it often did so not by naming a tune, but by speaking of its quality. It was said to be unusually clear, almost impossibly so, as though each note had been washed clean of dust, effort, and the roughness that clings to mortal performance. There was no strain in it, no sign of fingers slipping on strings, no wavering of breath, no human imperfection to make it intimate. And yet it was not cold. Its purity did not feel mechanical or sterile. It felt living in some finer, stranger register, sweet beyond expectation, delicate without weakness. Is shaped with such grace that the listener sensed at once that this was no common air wandering over the fields. Even when faint, it had a completeness about it, as if the smallest fragment implied a larger pattern, too subtle for the ear to grasp all at once. It seemed less played than released into the night, already whole, already ordered by a skill no human musician could fully command. Part of its strangeness lay in the way it refused ordinary distance. A village tune heard across a valley could usually be placed with some confidence. There was the farmhouse, there the barn, there the road from which the sound must be travelling. Fairy music unsettled such certainty. It could seem near enough to follow, as though just beyond the next hedge or rising from the hollow behind a familiar field. Then, as the listener turned toward it, it would feel impossibly far away, lodged on a hill no footpath truly reached, or somewhere beyond the ridge where the mist thickened and the moon gave less light. It hovered in that bewildering condition of being both intimate and remote, both beckoning and withdrawn. One could not easily tell whether the melody was approaching or receding, whether it wished to be found or merely wished to be followed. And that uncertainty gave it much of its power. It denied the ear its usual trust in space, and in doing so loosened the will as well. It is telling, too, that such music did not require words. Human songs often carry their invitation openly, a refrain to join, a story to remember, a blessing, a lament, a declaration of love or loss. But the music of the hidden world was thought to call without language. Its summons lay in tone alone, in cadence, in the exquisite curve of sound itself. That made it, in some ways, more intimate than speech. Words can be weighed, argued with, refused. A melody passes beneath such defences. It enters the mind without announcing an argument, stir and feeling before thought has arranged its caution. A person might not know what the tune promised, only that it seemed to answer some private hunger, rest for weariness, company for solitude, a forgotten joy, a tenderness glimpsed but never held. That was why the old stories so often speak of listeners pausing in spite of themselves, turning aside almost before they had decided to do so. The call was not a command. It was an enchantment of inclination, and because it worked by attraction rather than force, its danger appeared almost merciful at first, and nothing in fairy music needed to snarl or threaten. It could remain lovely from beginning to end and still be perilous. In that old belief, beauty was not harmless simply because it was beautiful. Indeed, beauty could be the very means by which a person was led away from the safe pattern of ordinary life. The road home might still lie open behind him. The gate might still stand where it always had. His own name, his own hearth, and his own people might still exist in the human world. But the tune made those things seem, for a moment, less urgent than the promise trembling just beyond sight. To take one step off the road in search of music was, in these stories, rarely an act of greed or boldness. More often it was a yielding to wonder, a surrender to something so achingly lovely that refusal felt like a kind of loss. That is what made the warning so tender and so severe. The danger did not lie in ugliness to be recoiled from, but in loveliness too persuasive to resist. So when people spoke of fairy music, they did not mean a monstrous noise rising from a haunted dark. They meant a beauty that had crossed the threshold between worlds and entered the human night in audible form. It was distant, yet it touched the heart at once, sourceless, yet perfectly shaped, uncanny, yet never crude enough to break the spell with obvious terror. It belonged neither to the cheerful noise of the village nor to the intimate singing of the home, but to the hidden places beyond both, to mounds under moonlight, to mist among the fields, to the margins where the seen world softened and another seemed to lean close. And because such music was believed to be most dangerous precisely when it was most lovely, the old warnings around it deepened rather than faded. For the next question was not only what this music was, but what in all its sweetness it asked of those who listened too long. The danger, in the old understanding, was simple to name even if it was difficult to resist. The music did not wound the body or rush upon the listener like a storm. It did not seize, it invited. Its power lay in making a person want to go where he should not go, and want it so gently that the wanting scarcely felt like danger at all. That was the heart of the warning remembered in rural Ireland. Some things could draw a soul away more surely by sweetness than by threat. A harsh cry from the dark would send a traveller hurrying toward the road home, but a lovely sound heard beneath the moon might make him pause, turn his head, and listen twice. Wonder came first. The trouble began there, in that still moment when caution softened and the night seemed to offer something finer than ordinary safety. Beauty has always had a curious authority over human judgment. It asks for trust before it has earned it. A lovely face, a lovely voice, a lovely evening light on the hills, such things persuade the heart with an ease that reason rarely matches. In the folklore of fairy music, that persuasion was everything. The melody was believed to thin the listener's ordinary defences not by confusion alone, but by delight. It made suspicion feel coarse, almost ungrateful. Why recoil from what sounded so delicate, so perfectly shaped, so full of a sorrowful sweetness the heart seemed already to know? The old stories understood that danger does not always approach in an ugly form. Sometimes it comes clothed in grace, asking not for surrender in one great act, but for the soft lowering of one's guard. A person who would never run toward a cry of terror might drift willingly toward a tune that seemed to promise rest, companionship, or a forgotten tenderness just out of reach. So the first step was often a very small one. No one in these stories meant at the outset to abandon the human world. The listener only moved a little closer. He stepped from the centre of the lane to its grassy edge. He paused at a gate and leaned upon it, trying to hear more clearly. He crossed a stile he had crossed 100 times by day, thinking only that the sound must surely be coming from the next field, or from the rise beyond the hedge, or from the hollow where mist had gathered silver under the moon. That is what makes the warning feel so human and so enduring. Ruin does not begin with grand decision. It begins with curiosity made tender by beauty. The traveller tells himself he will go no farther than the next turning. He will only listen long enough to place the tune. He will only take a few steps and then return to the road home. Yet already the shape of the night has changed around him. Already he is moving by desire rather than direction. And once the known path is left behind, the old stories suggest that more than location begins to slip. The road home was not merely a strip of ground. It was the visible thread binding a person to the human order. Hearth, kin, memory, duty, mourning, the world of names and ordinary time. To step away from it under the spell of distant music was to loosen oneself from that order, even if only by degrees. A hedge crossed in moonlight could feel like more than a hedge. A field entered at the wrong hour could become a space in which familiar distances no longer behaved as they should. The listener might believe he was drawing nearer to the tune, yet the tune remained always just beyond him, moving as he moved, turning him farther from the lane, farther from the cottage lights, farther from any place that would have looked plain and trustworthy by daylight. In some tales, the traveller lost his bearings. In others, he lost his sense of time. In still others, he found that the land itself seemed altered, as if he had crossed without realizing it, into a place that ran beside the world he knew, but is no longer governed by its mercies. The consequence grew from the warning in a quiet chain. To follow was to stray was to become vulnerable to a world not meant for human ease. This was why the warning endured as inherited wisdom rather than mere superstition. It belonged to a larger habit of caution, in which older generations taught the young that not everything delightful was safe, and not every invitation should be accepted simply because it arrived in beautiful form. Ireland's folklore is full of such restraint. Leave the fairy thorn uncut, though it stands inconveniently in a field. Avoid the ancient mound, even if it lies in the best grazing ground. Do not answer every voice that calls at night. Do not touch every brightness that gleams under moonlight. Beneath all these cautions lies the same principle. The visible world is not the whole world, and courtesy toward mystery includes knowing when to keep one's distance. Fairy music fit easily into this moral landscape. It was not forbidden because joy itself was suspect, but because the old imagination recognized that longing can be led astray. To resist the tune was not to reject beauty. It was to remember that beauty too must sometimes be honoured by refusal. There is something especially piercing in that idea, perhaps because it runs against the ordinary trust we place in lovely things. Frightening things announce their danger honestly. The body recoils, the mind sharpens, the instinct to survive gathers itself at once. But what is lovely slips through another entrance. It can make surrender feel noble, or harmless, or even inevitable. A frightening shape in a field would send a traveller back toward the road. A beautiful tune might persuade him that the road was dull, that caution was a kind of blindness, that whatever waited beyond the hedge was more worthy than the familiar world he meant to return to. And this is why, in the old stories, lovely things could be more dangerous than dreadful ones. Terror keeps a person bound to himself. Enchantment tempts him out of himself. Fear says, preserve what you are. Beauty may whisper, become something else. The fairy music was unsettling precisely because it offered no violence to resist, only a sweetness that made resistance feel like loss. That is a subtler peril, and perhaps the more lasting one. Yet the warning was never entirely severe. It carried within it a melancholy tenderness, as though those who repeated it understood exactly why anyone might yield. After all, who would not wish, for a moment, to follow what seems more radiant than the weary customs of earthly life? Who would not feel the pull of a song that appears to know the heart's loneliness before the heart has named it for itself? The old wisdom did not mock that impulse. It only answered it with patient caution. Stay on the road home, it said. Listen if you must, wonder if you must, but do not go too far. For somewhere beyond the lane, beyond the gate, beyond the familiar field where the mist gathers and the moon lays silver across the grass, there are hidden places where beauty deepens into peril, and where the music that seems most gentle may have risen from a world that does not easily give back what it draws to itself. And to understand that danger fully, one must look next toward the places from which such music was most often believed to come. In the old imagination, fairy music did not come from nowhere. However sourceless it sounded in the moment, people still believed it belonged to places, certain kinds of places, marked not always by grandeur but by age, loneliness, and a peculiar persistence in local memory. The night itself might make the sound harder to place, allowing it to drift over fields and travel strangely through mist, yet tradition gave it an origin all the same. It was said to rise from the hidden geography of Ireland, from hills that seemed too self-contained, from mounds older than any living household, from ring forts lying quiet in pasture, from bends in the road where travellers instinctively lowered their voices. In this way, the landscape became not merely a backdrop for enchantment, but its dwelling place. Yeah, music belonged to the land because the land was believed to hold more than soil, grass and stone. It held memory, taboo, and the lingering nearness of another order of life. Among the most enduring of these places were the hills and mounds that seemed, especially under moonlight, to possess a life folded inward upon itself. Ireland is full of such rises in the earth, green, rounded, often unremarkable at first glance, and yet strangely complete in their shape, as if they had not simply formed but settled there with intention. Some were ancient burial places, some were associated with stories of the Sidhe, and some were simply known in local feeling as places not to disturb. By day they might appear calm, grassy and ordinary enough, visited only by sheep and weather. But at night they changed. Their curves gathered shadow. Their silence took on depth. If music was heard on the wind, it was easy in such an hour to imagine it coming from within the hill rather than upon it, as though the earth itself had opened a hidden chamber and let a tune escape. That idea, that a hillside might contain an interior world unseen by human eyes, gave these places their hold over the imagination. A mound was no longer merely a feature of ground. It was a sealed threshold, beautiful on the outside, secret at its heart. Closely bound to this same spiritual geography were the ring forts and old earthworks scattered across the countryside. These circular enclosures, so common in Ireland, carried with them an atmosphere of caution, long after their original makers were forgotten by ordinary memory. Their banks and ditches sat gently in the landscape, often softened by grass, ere partially broken by time, and yet still clear enough to suggest that human hands had once shaped them with care. Folklore did not leave them empty. Many came to be treated as fairy forts, places connected with the hidden folk, and therefore not to be damaged, built over, or entered casually after dark. Stories clung to them with unusual tenacity. A farmer might plough around one rather than through it. A road might bend rather than cut across its edge. Such habits were not always born from terror. Often they felt more like an old courtesy extended toward whatever the place might still contain. And if music was heard near one of these earthworks on a still night, the setting itself gave the sound a meaning. The fort, quiet and moon-washed in the field, seemed less like a ruin than a boundary between the visible world and another one preserved beneath custom and restraint. Yet not all enchanted places stood out so clearly. Some of the most suggestive were found along roads, at field edges, and on lonely bends where the ordinary business of travel gave way to a sudden feeling of unease or expectancy. A lane running between hedges could seem entirely practical by day, and curiously self-contained by night. A gate opening from road to pasture might acquire after sunset the air of a decision rather than a simple entrance. There were places where two paths met and then separated again into darker country, places where the road dipped into shadow and rose toward an unseen ridge, places where the last cottage lay behind and only open ground remained ahead. Fairy music was often imagined in relation to such margins. It might drift from beyond the hedge, from the next field over, from somewhere just off the known path. That mattered because the danger was always linked to deviation. The road home represented continuity, habit, the human world made navigable. Music heard from the side of it, or from a bend where one could not quite see what lay beyond, belonged naturally to the logic of enchantment. It asked not only to be heard, but to be followed away from what was clear. Fields, too, could become strangely charged in the old stories, especially when they contained some small irregularity that resisted easy explanation. A greener circle in the grass, a slight hollow where mist collected, a lone thorn standing where no one had cut it, a patch of ground avoided by grazing animals. Such things gave a place character before any music had touched it. People often felt that certain spots announced themselves softly, by atmosphere rather than event. One field might feel merely open and practical. Another, nearly identical in daylight, might seem after dusk to be holding itself apart. The difference was difficult to measure, but easy to feel. The air could seem heavier there, or more attentive. Silence might gather more densely. Even without a tune on the wind, a person might hurry his steps or keep to the outer path. This sensitivity to place is one of the most delicate features of Irish folklore. It suggests that enchantment was not always dramatic. Sometimes a place was set apart by nothing more than a subtle pressure on the senses, a feeling that the land was not offering itself fully to human use. If music later emerged from such a place, it did not create the mystery, it confirmed it. Behind all these beliefs lay a larger and more beautiful idea, that land could shelter another presence without ceasing to be itself. A hill remained a hill, a fort remained an earthwork, a field remained a field. Folklore did not require the visible world to vanish in order for another world to be near. Instead, it imagined overlap, nearness, and inhabitation. Certain places were quiet, but never truly empty. Their stillness was not absence, but reserve. Their power came from the suggestion that something might be there without showing itself openly, something old, self-contained, and bound to the place more deeply than any passing human life. This is why taboo mattered so much. To leave a fort untouched, to avoid cutting a fairy thorn, to speak carefully when crossing certain ground, was not merely to obey fear. It was to acknowledge that the land had claims older than one's own. And music, when it came from such places, seemed to prove that the silence had never been vacant after all. It had only been listening in its own way, waiting until the hour when it might answer itself in song. So the map of Enchanted Ireland was not drawn only in great landmarks or famous names. It was traced through mounds in fields, through circular forts in pasture, through lonely roads, misty hollows, and places where the hedges seemed to lean close, and the moonlight lingered strangely on the grass. Each kind of place added something different to the old belief. The hills suggested hidden interiors. The forts preserved ancient boundaries. The roads and field edges invited dangerous turning aside. The charged quiet of certain spots taught people that a place could feel inhabited before anything visible occurred. All of this prepared the imagination for the next and most intimate question. If such music rose from these hidden places, who then was believed to dwell within them? Who played? Who sang? And who waited just beyond the reach of the road home? In the old Irish imagination, The music so often heard and so little understood was rarely left without a people to belong to. If it drifted from the hills, if it wandered through mist without a visible musician, if it seemed too lovely and too complete to have come from any ordinary house of festivity, then many believed it belonged to the Sidhe. The word itself carries a softness, almost like a breath released into the dark, yet what it names is neither slight nor simple. The Sidhe were not mere spirits of the air, nor harmless little creatures of children's fancy. They belonged to that older order of beings who inhabited the hidden world beside the human one, beautiful, powerful, reserved, and touched with a remoteness that made them at once fascinating and difficult to trust. To speak of their music was to speak of a sound shaped by all those qualities at once. They were bound, above all, to the land, not the land in its everyday usefulness, but the land in its depth, secrecy, and memory. Their dwellings were not imagined as distant heavens, but as hidden interiors within the country itself, beneath green mounds, within the ancient hills, under ring forts softened by weather and centuries, inside those beautiful rises of earth that seemed complete in themselves and strangely sealed. A hillside in Ireland could be merely a hillside by day, and yet in folklore it might also be an entrance, a covered threshold, the outer surface of a world folded inward from human sight. The Sidhe belonged to that hidden geography. They were not always thought of as wandering far from it. Rather, their presence made sense because the land itself was believed to shelter them. This gave the countryside a double life. A mound could be grass and earth, and also a dwelling. A hill could be stone and shadow, and also a door. If music was heard near such a place, it was not difficult for the old imagination to understand it as the sound of life continuing within, and the beings imagined there were rarely crude or monstrous. The Sidhe were associated again and again with beauty, yet beauty of a kind that made human life appear briefly roughened by comparison. They were graceful, finely made, radiant without warmth, courteous without intimacy. In story and tradition, their distance from mortal life mattered as much as their charm. They were not villagers more elegant than other villagers. They were not simply noble figures in green garments beneath the hill. They belonged to a mode of existence that seemed at once richer and less forgiving than ours, ordered by older rhythms and stranger loyalties. Human beings ploughed fields, nursed children, buried their dead, gathered by the fire and made songs out of labour and grief. The Sidhe seemed to live beyond such necessities. Their beauty suggested freedom from hardship, but also freedom from human tenderness. To encounter anything of their world was to feel, perhaps, the ache of being mortal in the presence of something more refined, more enduring, and less reachable. Music belonged naturally to such a realm because sound can travel where bodies cannot. If the hidden world of the Sidhe touched the human one only in glancing ways, then music was the perfect form of contact, intangible, alluring, impossible to hold, and capable of crossing boundaries without breaking them. One might never see the door in the hill open. One might never glimpse a gathering beneath the mound. But a tune could pass outward through the dark and make itself known on the air. In this sense, fairy music feels less like an ornament of the tradition than an extension of the hidden realm itself. It carried the same qualities the Sidhe were believed to possess: elegance, distance, otherness, beauty sharpened by restraint. The music did not merely belong to them as a pastime belongs to a household. It seemed to proceed from their very condition of being, as though their world could not help but express itself in ordered sound. The melody heard at night was not just something they played, it was, in a way, the atmosphere of their existence made audible. and that is why the old descriptions of such music so often lean toward words like ancient, sorrowful, and graceful. The sound associated with the Sidhe was rarely imagined as wild merriment alone, though dance and festivity certainly hover around some stories. More often it feels touched by age, memory, and a beauty too deep to be entirely cheerful. There is often a sadness in it, not the raw grief of human bereavement, but a finer, more distant melancholy, as though the tune carried the memory of a world already half lost even to itself. It is music that seems to know too much and explain too little. Each note feels shaped by patience. Each phrase seems to arrive already complete, with no visible labour behind it. Human music bears the marks of breath, fingers, communal life, and momentary feeling. The music of the Sidhe seems older than all that, as if it had been sounding in hidden chambers long before the present listener paused on the road to hear it. The grace of it lies partly in this age. It feels worn smooth by time, but never diminished. No wonder, then, that human listeners in the old stories found it nearly impossible to resist. The attraction was not only that the tune was beautiful, but that it appeared to answer some inward longing human life could not quite satisfy. To hear such music was to sense, however dimly, another mode of being, more polished than village festivity, more luminous than household comfort, less burdened by effort, less confined by weather, hunger, labour, and sleep. The heart might not have formed these thoughts clearly, yet it felt them, as the music suggested a world in which every rough edge had been refined away, in which sorrow itself had been made elegant, in which distance had become part of beauty rather than its enemy. A traveller hearing it on a moonlit road might feel, all at once, both comforted and unmoored, as though the melody had found the exact seam between weariness and desire. It did not need to promise anything openly. It only needed to make the listener feel that beyond the hedge, beyond the field, beyond the dark shoulder of the hill, there existed something more exquisite than the life he knew. Yet that allure was inseparable from the fact that the Sidhe were never fully knowable. Their beauty did not make them intimate. Their music did not make them kind in any simple human sense. They remained beings of reserve, secrecy, and another order whose purposes could not be measured by mortal wishes. This is essential to their power in the tradition. If they had been wholly malicious, the warning would have been easier to keep. If they had been wholly benevolent, there would have been no warning at all. Instead, they occupied that far more unsettling ground where loveliness and danger meet without cancelling one another. Their songs could sound merciful, but mercy was not guaranteed. Their presence could seem near, yet their inner life remained closed. A person might feel drawn toward them and still know almost nothing of what awaited beyond the threshold. In that sense, the Sidhe gave fairy music its deepest meaning. The tune was alluring because they were alluring. It was dangerous because they were beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The sound inherited the mystery of its source, so the music of the Sidhe was never merely background to the folklore of night. It was one of the clearest signs that another world was pressing softly against the visible one. From hidden dwellings in hills and mounds, from earthworks left undisturbed, from quiet places where the land seemed to listen to itself, their melodies drifted outward carrying beauty, distance, sorrow, and invitation all at once. They brought with them the impression of a realm older and finer than human life, yet also colder in its perfection, more difficult to enter safely, and harder still to leave behind once one had begun to feel its pull. And because the song itself was only the first touch of that hidden world upon the mortal heart, The next question becomes even more intimate. What happened within the listener when such music was heard too long, too deeply, or too willingly? The first response to such music was not outward, but inward. Before a foot moved, before the head turned fully toward the dark, something within the listener grew still and alert at once. The ordinary thread of thought, with its small practical concerns, seemed to loosen. The mind no longer measured the road, the lateness of the hour, or the distance left to travel home. Instead, it paused, as though listening not only with the ear but with some more private chamber of the self. The tune entered there softly. It did not strike like alarm. It settled, delicate and persuasive, into the hush beneath thought, where feeling often arrives before reason has found a name for it. In that first moment, the listener did not yet think, "I am being called." He only felt that the night had suddenly become more meaningful than it had been a breath before. Then attention began to narrow. The wider world did not vanish, but it receded, as a landscape recedes when a single candle draws the eye in a darkened room. The road home remained underfoot, pale in the moonlight. The hedges still held their lines, the mist still lay in the hollows of the fields, yet all of these became secondary, softened at the edges by the growing importance of the sound itself. The music seemed to gather the listener's senses toward it, asking for no effort and permitting no easy division of attention. One no longer heard the distant stream or the stir of leaves with the same clarity. The tune made a centre of itself. It became the quiet axis upon which the whole night seemed to turn. And because it was beautiful, this narrowing did not feel like a loss. It felt like relief, yet as though the scattered world had suddenly arranged itself around one true thing. Only after this inward yielding did the body begin its smaller obediences. A person might lift his head a little, or take one step to the edge of the lane where the sound seemed clearer. He might pause at a gate with no conscious intention of opening it, then find his hand already resting on the latch. He might lean toward the hedge, listening, and only later notice that he had crossed the grassy margin and left the centre of the road behind. This is what the old stories understand so well. The body often follows where attention has already gone. By the time judgment begins to protest, movement has begun in miniature. Not flight, not reckless pursuit, only a soft rearranging of posture and direction, so gentle that it appears almost innocent. The listener is not yet running toward enchantment. He is merely consenting to nearness. Yet that consent, however small, is the beginning of the path away from safety. What made this movement so subtle was that the invitation came without speech. No voice called the traveller by name. No promise was spoken aloud from the hill or the field beyond the hedge. The song did not argue, command, or explain itself. It drew close in another way, shaping in the heart a sense of being wanted without ever saying so. This is perhaps why it felt more intimate than words could have done. Speech remains outside us for a time. It can be weighed, mistrusted, answered. But music seems to enter by a more secret door. It does not ask permission in the same manner. It surrounds, inclines, suggests. Now, the listener feels less that he has heard a message than that he has become part of one. Something in the melody seems directed toward him personally, though no sentence can be extracted from it. It is an invitation in pure form, unburdened by language, and therefore harder to refuse. Such an invitation found its strength in longing. The old tales imply again and again that fairy music did not create hunger from nothing. It touched what was already present. It found the loneliness hidden beneath habit, the weariness beneath duty, the quiet ache that even an ordinary life keeps folded away from view. A traveller returning late along a moonlit road might not have thought himself sorrowful until the tune awakened some tenderness he had almost forgotten how to feel. A lonely heart might hear in it the promise of companionship. A tired one might hear rest. A restless one might hear the shape of an elsewhere more exquisite than home. The music did not need to specify what it offered, because each listener, in a sense, supplied that for himself. The hidden world became a mirror for inward want. The song seemed to understand before the listener understood, and that feeling of being known, so sudden, so wordless, made the pull all the more difficult to resist. Why is the heart so vulnerable to beauty? Perhaps because beauty often reaches us where discipline cannot. We can reason against danger, guard against insult, withstand what is plainly harsh. But what is lovely touches another faculty altogether. It persuades by giving delight before it asks anything in return. It opens the spirit, and an opened spirit is both enriched and exposed. The old wisdom around fairy music rests on this quiet truth. Human beings are not tempted only by greed or fear, they are also tempted by what seems finer than themselves, by what shines with a grace they do not wish to lose. Beauty can make surrender feel reverent rather than reckless. It can persuade a person that to resist is to turn away from something precious. And because the song came wrapped in gentleness, it did not feel like an assault upon the will. It felt like the awakening of a truer will, one more honest than caution, more faithful than routine. That is why the enchantment ran so deep. The listener did not believe he was betraying himself. He believed, for a moment, that he was moving toward what the heart had always secretly sought. So the invitation hidden inside the song worked first by stilling the mind, then by drawing the attention inward and away from the wider world, then by allowing the body to follow in those slight and fateful degrees that seem hardly worthy of warning until the warning proves too late. It called without words, answered private longing, and used beauty not as decoration but as the very means of enchantment. Wonder deepened into inclination, inclination into movement, movement into the beginning of surrender. And once a person had crossed that delicate inner threshold, once he had given the music not only his hearing but his direction, the old stories say the next stage began. For then the question was no longer how the song invited, but what became of those who accepted and went after it into the night. The old belief did not endure because everyone resisted. It endured because some, it was said, did follow. Not always boldly, not always with any clear intention of going far, but in the quiet way these stories understand so well. A pause on the road, a turn toward the hedge, a step across wet grass where no step was meant to be taken at that hour. In the telling of such things, people were not usually portrayed as reckless fools rushing into obvious peril. They were listeners overcome by wonder, travellers persuaded by beauty, solitary figures whose caution had been softened by the sweetness of the tune. That is what gives these old patterns their lingering force. The consequences did not arise from violence openly done to them, but from their own yielding to something they could neither place nor wholly refuse. Yet one of the most familiar outcomes was simple wandering. A person who meant only to listen more closely would leave the road and go after the sound, convinced it came from the next rise, or from beyond the stand of trees, or from the field behind the old fort where the mist lay thickest. Yet the tune never settled into any ordinary source. It drifted onward as the listener moved, always near enough to justify another few steps, always distant enough to keep the pursuit alive. In this way, a pathless crossing began. The lane disappeared behind him. Gates no longer mattered. Hedges were slipped through where no crossing had been planned. and all the while the country itself seemed altered by moonlight into a gentler and less reliable shape, and so that what by day would have been recognised as familiar ground now offered no clear direction back. The person had not set out to become lost, yet in folklore this is often how the loss began, not with panic, but with a slow unravelling of orientation under the spell of a beautiful sound. So there are many old patterns of people being found far from where they had last been seen, discovered at dawn or in the grey light before it, standing in a distant field, seated by a mound, wandering on the far side of a hill they had no reason to cross in the night. Sometimes they were found barefoot, though they had set out properly shod, or with their clothing damp from marsh grass and morning dew, as if they had passed through places no sensible traveller would have chosen in darkness. Sometimes they stood looking bewildered, as though the land around them had changed places while they were listening. The strange thing in such accounts is not merely distance, but dislocation. They had not gone where any intention could have clearly led them. They had been drawn into a geography of detour, carried beyond the useful map of roads and gates into some looser arrangement of hill, field, and hollow. This outcome strengthened the old warning because it seemed to confirm that fairy music did not guide a person toward a destination so much as away from the ordinary order of return. There were also stories, quieter and more unsettling, of those who vanished for a time. A person expected home by nightfall was not seen until much later, or not until the next day, or after a longer absence that could not be easily accounted for by weather or mistake. While in such patterns the emphasis falls not on spectacle, but on the soft gap itself, the missed return, the empty place at the hearth, the unanswered waiting. Folklore often leaves the interval indistinct, and that indistinctness is part of its power. What happened during the missing hours, or days, is rarely described with certainty. It is enough that the person was gone, and that the last suggestion of their presence had something to do with music heard at the wrong hour near the wrong place. Such disappearances need not be violent in the telling to feel profound. Their force lies in the idea that one might step a little too near the hidden world and simply fail, for a while, to come back through its threshold into ordinary life. And then there were those who did return, yet not entirely as before. The old stories often speak of such people in softened terms, quieter than they had been, less ready with ordinary speech, uncertain when asked where they had gone or what they had heard. They might seem dazed for a time, or carry a lingering air of distraction, as though part of their attention remained turned towards something no one else could perceive. Some were said to remember little, others remembered a sweetness they could not explain and could not stop thinking of. A person might return to the road home and to the household waiting there, yet still seem inwardly delayed, as if the journey back had not been complete. This alteration is one of the gentlest and saddest features of the tradition. The hidden world is not always imagined as leaving obvious marks. Sometimes it leaves only a hush, a distance in the eyes, a sense that the returned one has brushed against an order of beauty too strange to be comfortably folded back into daily speech. Memory, in these patterns, becomes uncertain in exactly the way enchantment would make it uncertain. The listener may remember the first notes clearly, the moon over the fields, the hush of the night, the odd certainty that the sound was just ahead. After that, things loosen. Distance becomes hard to judge. Sequence blurs. What was near feels far. What took minutes feels like hours. What seemed like a single lane or field turns into an entire countryside crossed without recollection of how. This confusion is not presented merely as forgetfulness. It has the flavour of another order pressing against the habits by which human beings measure space and event. The person has not simply failed to pay attention, and he has been led through a kind of experience that resists ordinary retelling. That is why so many such stories sound incomplete, as though the teller himself stands on the edge of what can be said and goes no farther. Enchantment leaves gaps. It removes the clear joints between one moment and the next, and so the memory of fairy music lingers not as a full account, but as a fragment of sweetness surrounded by uncertainty. Because of this, these stories did important work in the life of the community. They turned private bewilderment into shared caution. A lane where someone had wandered strangely became a place to pass more mindfully after dark. A field near an old fort gathered added reserve around it. Parents repeated the old warnings to the young not as abstract superstition, but as counsel shaped by remembered patterns. Keep to the road home. Do not cross the grass toward music you cannot place. Do not linger by the mound when the light is fading and the air grows still. The stories did not need to prove themselves by exact detail. Their authority lay in repetition, in the sense that many versions of the same danger had been known for too long to be lightly dismissed. Even those who might laugh by daylight often became quieter about such places at night. In that way, folklore preserved not only belief but behaviour. It taught people how to move through a landscape thought to be beautiful, inhabited, and not entirely meant for careless pursuit. What lingers most softly in these traditions is the recognition that what was lost was not always a body, nor even always a person in the full sense, but sometimes a clear belonging to ordinary time and place. To follow the sound was to risk becoming for a while unmoored, to wander beyond the faithful logic of roads and doorways into a region where beauty itself could confuse the mind and delay the return. Some came back by morning, some returned after a troubling absence, some were found where no one expected them. Some carried home only a silence no one could quite interpret. Yet in every version, the music had done its work without force. It had led by loveliness. It had persuaded by refinement. It had drawn the listener into a softened and altered world where the common measures of safety no longer held quite firm. And it is here that another, even stranger strand of the old belief begins to emerge. For among the most unsettling consequences of following fairy music was not only that people wandered, vanished, or returned changed, but that the very passage of time around them seemed no longer trustworthy. A night might not remain a night. A brief listening might not remain brief. And the music, so light upon the air, was often said to carry with it a rhythm belonging not only to another place, but to another measure of time itself. Among the oldest and most persistent ideas in fairy lore is the belief that time in the hidden world does not move as it does in ours. This is not always described as a law, nor explained in any cold or orderly way. It appears instead as a pattern, a sorrowful strangeness repeated across story after story. A person hears music, lingers, follows, listens a little too long, and then discovers that the human measure of hours has loosened without warning. A brief wandering under the moon may prove to have consumed a night. A night may open into something longer. The mortal world, with its clocks unspoken but deeply felt, its fires needing tending, its doors closing at dusk, its people expecting return by morning, continues onward in its own faithful rhythm. But the fairy realm, if touched even lightly, yet seems to draw the listener into another current altogether, and when the two currents part again, the loss is often discovered too late. Music made this idea especially persuasive because music itself alters the sense of duration even in ordinary life. A tune can gather the mind so completely that minutes pass unnoticed. A repeated phrase, a graceful turn of melody, a rhythm that seems to circle rather than end. All these can loosen the strictness with which the waking mind keeps account of time. Folklore takes that familiar human experience and deepens it into enchantment. Fairy music was not only beautiful sound, it was a medium through which time itself seemed to soften. Under its influence, the listener ceased to count. He no longer marked how long he had stood by the gate, how far he had walked from the road home, or how high the moon had risen above the fields. The tune made duration feel unimportant, or perhaps made it disappear altogether. What mattered was only the next phrase, the next delicate unfolding of sound, the next shimmer of sweetness just beyond completion. In that suspension, ordinary time loosened its hold, and another measure, older, hidden, and perilously gentle, began to take its place. So one of the most haunting patterns in these traditions is the transformation of a moment into an absence. A person pauses only briefly, or believes he does. He hears a strain of music drifting from the hill, or from the far side of a ring fort, or from the mist that gathers in the hollow beyond the field. He listens. Perhaps he takes a few steps. Perhaps he feels, with the serene confidence enchantment often gives, and that there is ample time to hear more and still return home before the hour grows too late. Yet when he is next found, or when he next finds the road again, a long stretch of night has already gone. The stars have shifted. Dawn is whitening the east. The fire he left behind has burned low. People who expected him hours earlier have long since begun to worry. In the old stories, this does not always appear as dramatic shock. Often it enters quietly, with the soft bewilderment of someone who cannot understand how the dark has ripened so far while he was doing nothing, as it seemed, but listening. In deeper and sadder forms of the motif, the return is not merely late but estranged. The listener comes back to a world that has continued without him, and its continuance is what wounds. A lane once familiar feels altered by morning light. A household has passed through hours of concern, waiting, or grief while he moved within what felt to him like no long interval at all. In broader fairy lore, this pattern extends further still. A short stay becomes years, a dance becomes a vanished lifetime, and the one who returns finds that the world he meant to resume has drifted beyond reach. Even when the tale of fairy music does not go so far, it carries the same emotional logic. Time lost is not merely time missing, it is time in which one's place in the human order has gone on without one's presence. The door has remained shut, the meal has been eaten, the expected footstep has not come. Ordinary life, so modest and so mortal, reveals its worth most sharply when enchantment has made a person absent from it. That is why the motif feels more sorrowful than terrifying. There is eeriness in it, certainly, but the deepest note is gentler and sadder. To lose time under the spell of fairy music is not like surviving an attack. It is more like awakening from a sweetness that has cost too much. The listener is not broken by force. He is separated by enchantment from the humble continuities that make a human life feel held together. The path home taken at the right hour, the familiar face expecting return, the simple trust that an evening will unfold into morning in the usual way. When that trust is interrupted, even briefly, the loss touches something tender. It suggests how delicate our belonging to time really is. We live by repetition: sunset, hearth, sleep, waking, labour, meal, dusk again, and fairy music in these old beliefs could slip a person sideways out of that pattern without his fully noticing it happen. The sadness lies in how little resistance such a loss may first require. To lose time is also, in a quiet sense, to lose one's place in oneself. Human identity is bound up with sequence, what we were doing, where we meant to go, how 1 hour led into the next. When enchantment interrupts that sequence, memory frays. The listener may remember the beginning vividly, the moonlit road, the first notes on the wind, the pull of beauty through the mist, but after that, continuity weakens. The self that intended to go home becomes separated from the self found at dawn in a distant field, or seated near a mound, or standing uncertain on the far side of a hill. Between those two selves lies a gap where ordinary time should have been. This makes the motif spiritually rich as well as narratively strange. It suggests that fairy music could do more than delay a traveller. It could loosen the thread by which a person remains steadily joined to his own earthly life. Home then becomes more than a place. It becomes the condition of remaining inside one's rightful measure of time, memory, and return. Seen in this light, the old warning not to follow beauty too far gained even more depth. It was never only about wandering into dangerous ground. It was about preserving one's place within the human rhythm of things. The road home mattered because it kept a person aligned not just with direction, but with duration, with the right passing of the hours, the expected return before dawn, the continuity of mortal obligations and mortal comforts. Now, fairy music threatened that alignment by making another rhythm seem momentarily better, or at least more compelling. Its cadence invited the listener to linger, and lingering was already the beginning of departure. What was lost might be only a night, but a night is not small when it belongs to the fabric of home. And in the more mythic reach of the tradition, what is lost may be far greater. Not merely an evening's safety, but the very world one meant to come back to unchanged. Beauty once again reveals itself as the subtle danger. It does not urge with violence. It asks only for one more moment, one more phrase, one more turning of the dance, and meanwhile the mortal world goes on. This is why time slip in fairy lore remains one of the most piercing images attached to enchantment. It captures the feeling that some experiences are costly, not because they are ugly, but because they are too lovely to notice when they begin to take us away from what sustains us. To stand listening beneath the moon while the tune moves through the dark may feel like stillness, yet already a separation is unfolding. The listener is being drawn into another measure, one in which the ordinary signs of passing, fatigue, lateness, duty, return, lose their authority. And when he emerges again, if he does, this sorrow lies not only in the lost hours themselves, but in the realization that the sweetness of the experience offered no warning equal to its cost. The hidden world has its own cadence, and mortal hearts, once attuned to it, may forget too easily the faithful and breakable tempo of home. From here, the old stories move naturally toward another image often bound to fairy music, the unseen revel. For if time could be altered by hearing such melodies, how much more might it bend where the music belonged fully to its own world, where dancing, feasting, and circular movement carried the listener beyond mere hearing into participation. The tune on the wind was sometimes only the outer edge of a greater festivity, something half concealed beneath the hill or within the ring of night. And so, the next step in this old mythology leads toward those hidden gatherings, where the music was not only heard from afar but joined, the fairy dances and revels that turned enchantment into a deeper and more perilous delight. In fairy lore, the music heard from the hills was often imagined as only the outermost sign of something larger and more dazzling concealed from human sight. A tune on the wind suggested company. A melody too fine for mortal hands implied dancers, brightness, and an unseen gathering already in motion somewhere beyond the hedge, beneath the mound, or within the hidden chambers of the hill. The old imagination did not leave such music standing alone in the dark. It gave it a setting, a revel of the other world, graceful and self-contained, where the she moved in circles of beauty untouched by fatigue or ordinary time. To hear the song was, in some sense, to overhear a celebration not meant for human lives, yet near enough to stir longing in any solitary traveller beneath the moon. That hidden revel was often pictured through movement first. One imagines the ring of dancers turning where no human lantern shone, either under the open moonlight in some secluded hollow, or within the bright interior of the hill itself, where earthly darkness gave way to another kind of radiance. Their motion was not clumsy or hurried, but perfectly measured, each step belonging to the music as naturally as ripples belong to water. The circling mattered. Fairy dance in folklore often carries the feeling of repetition without weariness, motion without end, delight without any visible cost. Round and round the company moved, garments catching a soft brightness, faces serene, the pattern of the dance renewing itself so gracefully that no beginning or conclusion seemed necessary. For a human listener, this vision would have been almost impossible not to follow inwardly. The moonlit road behind him was straight and dutiful. The hidden dance ahead was circular, luminous and free, and with the dance came the suggestion of feasting, not in the rough and hearty fashion of mortal gatherings, but in a more refined and effortless mode. Fairy revels were imagined as bright with abundance, vessels never empty, tables set without labour, pleasure offered without the visible burden of preparation or payment. There is something important in that ease. Human joy, however precious, is tied to work. Bread must be baked, fires must be laid, music must be learned, food must be gathered, tables cleared, children soothed, animals seen to, mourning faced. But the hidden court of the she seemed exempt from all such necessities. Its gladness appeared self-sustaining. The light there did not gutter, the music did not tire, the feast did not diminish. This made it not merely pleasant but dangerous to imagine. It offered a form of delight severed from duty, a vision of celebration with none of the weight that keeps human pleasure tender, temporary and dear. Under such enchantment, earthly obligations begin to loosen almost without resistance. The listener who only meant to hear a little more no longer feels the lateness of the hour as he should. The thought of the road home dims, the waiting hearth, the door left unlatched, the family expecting return, the animals to be tended at dawn, the humble sequence of tasks by which a life is held together. These fade not because they are despised, but because something more glittering has stepped before them. This is one of the gentlest and most unsettling truths in the old stories. A person does not always abandon the world from ingratitude. Sometimes he simply forgets it in the presence of a pleasure so polished, so effortless, so complete that ordinary life seems for a while unbearably coarse by comparison. The revel does not argue against duty, it outshines it, and once duty has been outshone, even briefly, the return to it becomes more difficult than the listener expected. Forgetting, then, is central to the enchantment, and it comes not as violence but as sweetness. The fairy revel does not demand that the mortal cast away his name, his home, or his promises in some dramatic renunciation. It merely surrounds him with music, movement, brightness, and company until those things grow faint of their own accord. This is why the old lore remains so psychologically subtle. Like it understands that the deepest traps are often the ones that feel most like release. To forget one's burdens for an hour can feel merciful. To forget time, duty and mortality altogether may feel like bliss. The hidden danger lies in how naturally the forgetting happens. One dance follows another, one cup is lifted, one turn of music melts into the next, and the mortal heart, relieved of care, ceases to ask how long it has been absent from the world it still belongs to. Enchantment works best when it feels like rest. Yet within this vision of unending pleasure, there is always a shadow of sadness, and the old stories rarely let us forget it for long. Joy without limit begins to resemble stillness. Celebration without ending no longer has the sweetness that comes from passing. Human happiness is precious partly because it cannot be held forever. A song ends, a feast is cleared, guests depart, the road home must be taken before dawn. These endings give earthly life its poignancy. But in the fairy revel, where delight seems to circle without conclusion, there is a hidden sorrow. The mortal who yields to it risks losing not only time, but the very pattern by which joy becomes meaningful. To remain forever in pleasure would be to remain forever away from change, labour, aging, and grief, but also away from growth, fidelity, return, and the fragile beauty of things that do not last. That is why forgetting the world is both blissful and tragic. It promises release from sorrow, yet asks in exchange for all the humble bonds that make a human life recognisably one's own. So the music of the other world, when imagined as dance and feast and brightness beneath the hill, carries its warning forward in a fuller form. What begins as a lovely tune on the wind opens into a realm where circling dancers never tire, tables never empty, and joy itself threatens to become a snare. The listener is not driven there by force, but drawn by the oldest longing of all, to step for a while beyond burden, beyond time, beyond the dim and breakable responsibilities of earth. And because that longing is so understandable, the folklore around fairy music remains tender even at its most cautionary. It does not mock the desire to follow beauty. It simply remembers what ordinary people, walking ordinary roads through the Irish night, felt they had to teach one another all the same, that however lovely the hidden revel might seem, there were practical warnings worth keeping, and simple precautions handed down to help a traveller stay within the human world. In Old Ireland, the warnings surrounding fairy music were not always spoken as grand declarations of belief. More often they lived in the quieter language of practical wisdom, offered the way one might offer advice about weather, water, or the handling of fire. A person was told how to move through certain hours, how to behave on certain roads, how to respond or refuse to respond when the night seemed to stir with something not wholly human. This is one of the most revealing features of the tradition. The taboo was not preserved merely as an ornament of storytelling, but as a habit of caution woven into everyday conduct. People did not need to solve the mystery of the hidden world in order to live carefully beside it. They only needed to know that some things were better not pursued, some invitations better left unanswered, and some beauties safer to admire from a distance. The clearest and most repeated rule was also the simplest: do not follow the sound. If music came over the fields at the wrong hour, if it seemed to drift from a hill with no visible house nearby, if it reached the ear with that peculiar sweetness and distance that marked it as unlike ordinary village festivity, then the safest thing was to remain where one was, or continue steadily on the road home. This warning did not ask for argument. It assumed that the danger lay precisely in the impulse to seek a source. Human curiosity naturally wants to resolve uncertainty, especially when what is uncertain is beautiful. But folklore answered that desire with a firm refusal. The listener was not to go nearer, not to take a few harmless steps for the sake of hearing more clearly, not to comfort himself with the thought that he would turn back after the next gate or the next rise. The first movement toward the sound was already understood as the beginning of danger. Safety lay not in courage, but in declining the invitation altogether. Closely joined to this was the rule against leaving the known path or crossing into places marked by old reserve. One was not to step off the road into a field merely because the music seemed better there. One was not to enter the ring fought at night, nor cross the grass around a fairy mound, nor linger beneath a solitary thorn where the land already carried its own reputation for otherness. These instructions feel deeply grounded in the realities of rural life. Roads and paths existed for a reason. They belonged to habit, direction, and return, and to leave them after dark was risky even without enchantment, and folklore gave that ordinary prudence a spiritual depth. The marked places of the landscape, mounds, forts, lonely bends, field edges where people instinctively lowered their voices, were treated not only as sites of possible danger, but as places deserving restraint. To keep one's distance was not always fear. Sometimes it was courtesy. Sometimes it was the acknowledgement that the land held memories and presences older than any single traveller's need to satisfy his curiosity. Another warning, equally important, concerned response. People were often told not to answer voices heard at night when no speaker could be seen, and this caution extended naturally to songs and calls that seemed to come from nowhere human. If the hidden world reached outward through sound, then answering it, whether by singing back, calling out, or speaking into the dark, could be understood as a kind of consent, a sign that contact had been accepted. Here again, the old wisdom was subtle. The danger was not always imagined as lying in some dramatic exchange, but in the opening created by acknowledgement. To answer was to turn fully toward what had only been hovering at the edge of awareness. It was to give shape to the invitation. Silence, by contrast, preserved a boundary. A person might hear, might wonder, might even feel the sweetness of the music pass through him, but he was still advised to keep his own voice to himself and continue on. In folklore, refusal need not be loud. It can be as quiet as not replying. These cautions were repeated through generations because they belong to experience as much as to imagination. One can almost hear how they would have been passed along, not with theatrical dread, but with a certain calm seriousness. Perhaps at the close of evening, perhaps when a child was old enough to walk alone between one house and another, perhaps when stories of someone wandering too far had surfaced again in local talk. The force of the warning lay partly in its familiarity. It was not a rare secret reserved for moments of crisis. It was part of knowing how to inhabit the countryside responsibly. Such knowledge gathered authority from repetition itself. Even those who might have doubted the literal truth of every tale could still preserve the practice, because the practice had become a form of inherited steadiness. To keep to the road, to avoid marked places after dark, was to answer nothing unseen. These were habits that link the living to the caution of those who had come before them, and in that sense the wisdom was communal even when the danger felt solitary. What emerges from all this is a very old respect for restraint. In many fairy traditions, survival depends less on boldness than on limits. Knowing when not to enter, not to touch, not to eat, not to speak, not to follow. This can seem at first like mere fearfulness, but it is something finer than that. It is humility before a world not fully arranged for human understanding. Restraint in such stories becomes a virtue because it protects both body and soul from the mistakes made when desire outruns wisdom. To hear something beautiful and decline to pursue it requires a kind of strength more inward than heroic. It asks a person to accept mystery without trying to possess it, to feel wonder without surrendering judgment, to remain faithful to the plain road home when the hidden world offers something brighter. In this way, caution becomes more than a defensive habit. It becomes a moral posture, a recognition that not everything lovely is given for our taking. And perhaps that is why these warnings endured so long and with such quiet tenderness. They were not only rules for avoiding harm, they were also expressions of a deeper truth about longing itself. Human beings are drawn toward beauty, toward song, toward the shimmer of a life that seems more radiant than the one they know. The old cautions did not deny that pull. They acknowledged it fully, which is why they had to be repeated with such patience. Do not answer. Do not turn aside. Whoa, do not leave the road. The words sound simple, but behind them lies an entire understanding of human vulnerability. That the heart can be moved most powerfully by what appears gentle, and that wisdom sometimes consists not in pursuing what enchants us, but in letting it remain beyond us. From here, the meaning of fairy music begins to deepen again. For beneath the warning itself lies another question, quieter and more reflective than the rules of safety alone. What did this beautiful danger express about longing, loss, and the human imagination that made such songs worth fearing in the first place? Perhaps, after all the warnings and old taboos, the gentlest question is the deepest one. What did fairy music truly mean to the people who imagined it so vividly and remembered it for so long? For it is possible to hear, beneath the folklore, something more than a cautionary tale about night roads and hidden hills. The music that drifted over fields in moonlight may also have carried the shape of a human feeling difficult to name, a feeling made of wonder, ache, and the sense that ordinary life, however beloved, is never the whole of what the heart desires. A tune with no visible source, heard where mist gathered, and the road home ran pale between hedges, is already more than a sound. It is an image of longing itself, beautiful, distant, impossible to hold, one and all the more powerful because it seems to come from somewhere just beyond the reach of daily life. Longing is perhaps the first and clearest meaning hidden inside the old belief. Not only longing for romance or adventure, but for something less easily spoken, for rest beyond weariness, for beauty without labour, for a tenderness untouched by disappointment, for a world more graceful than the one through which human beings must ordinarily make their way. The traveller who hears distant music at night is often alone, or at least inwardly alone, and that matters. Solitude sharpens the ear. It makes the faintest sweetness seem more personal, more directed, more capable of answering some private hunger. In that sense, fairy music may have expressed the old knowledge that the heart is not content with survival alone, or even in a life full of duty, kinship, and familiar affection, there remains a listening part of the self turned towards something finer, stranger, and never fully possessed. The music on the wind gave that hidden part a form. It let longing become audible in the landscape. At the same time, the music clearly belongs to temptation, not temptation in a crude moral sense, but the dream of another life opening suddenly beside one's own. To follow the sound is to imagine, for a moment, that the road one has walked for years is not the only road, that the dim gate at the field's edge may lead somewhere more radiant than home, that beyond the hill there might exist a realm where the burdens of mortal life fall away like mist under moonlight. This dream is ancient and deeply human. Nearly everyone has known in some quiet form the wish to step outside the given pattern of days and enter a life more luminous, more complete, more exquisitely arranged to the heart's desires. Fairy music shaped that wish into folklore. It became the sound of possibility itself, the murmur of an elsewhere so lovely that caution felt for a moment like self-denial. That is why the warning had to be so strong. The temptation was not toward wickedness, but toward escape disguised as beauty. Yet the old stories rarely separate that beauty from sorrow, and perhaps this is why they feel so lasting in the imagination. Fairy music is lovely, but it is seldom merely cheerful. Again and again it seems touched by melancholy, as if the tune itself knows that what it offers cannot be kept without cost. This blending of sweetness and sadness feels deeply true to human experience. The most beautiful things often carry ache within them. A song heard once and remembered for years, moonlight on a road one can no longer walk, the sense of a happiness almost reached and never fully held. Fairy music gathers all of that into one image. It is the sound of desire meeting limitation, of wonder shadowed by loss, of beauty appearing precisely where it cannot be safely followed. That is why it lingers so gently in the mind. It does not flatter us with easy consolation. It gives us instead something more recognizable and more tender, the knowledge that what most moves the heart may also be what most reminds it of absence. Stories like these endure because they hold emotional truths in forms the memory can keep. One may forget a rule or an argument, but not easily the image of a moonlit field, a road home fading behind, and a melody drifting from a hill no human musician occupies. Folklore survives where it joins feeling to image, and fairy music does this with rare delicacy. It gathers together so many things people have always felt but not always explained. The pull of the unknown, the weariness of ordinary burdens, the hunger for enchantment, the fear of losing oneself inside what one loves too much. It also gives shape to the uneasy knowledge that not every desire leads toward flourishing, and that some forms of beauty ask more from us than we can safely give. Because these truths do not belong to one century only, the stories continue to breathe. Even when belief changes, the feeling at their centre remains intelligible. We still know what it is to hear, somewhere at the edge of life, the suggestion of something lovelier than what we have. And in this way, the unseen world of fairy lore may be understood not only as another realm, but as a mirror held up to human desire. The hills, the mounds, the mist-filled hollows, the ring forts lying quiet in the grass, these become places where inward life seems to gather outside us, where longing takes on geography and dream acquires a voice. The hidden world is beautiful because it is composed in part of what human beings most yearn toward: grace without effort, delight without ending, music without flaw, belonging without loneliness, beauty not dimmed by time, and yet it is also perilous for exactly the same reason. What the imagination makes most radiant, it may also make unreachable. The Sidhe and their songs stand at that difficult border where desire becomes projection, where the wish for another world reveals both the richness and the vulnerability of the heart that wishes. The folklore does not mock that vulnerability. It honours it by surrounding it with story, warning, and moonlit image, as though to say, this is what humans have always been like, moved by what gleams beyond them, faithful and restless at once. Perhaps this, more than anything, explains why fairy music was worth fearing and worth remembering. It gave people a way to speak about the moments when ordinary life feels briefly too narrow for the soul, when the night itself seems to open and suggest that another order of beauty lies nearby, waiting only to be followed. But the stories also insist with a quiet wisdom that enchantment is not innocent simply because it is beautiful. Longing can deepen life, yet it can also pull us away from what sustains us. Dreams can enlarge the spirit, yet they can also estrange us from the faithful and fragile world to which we belong. So the music remains suspended between meanings, temptation and consolation, wonder and warning, beauty and loss. And from here the story leans naturally toward its most tender note of all, for hidden inside the enchantment is always a strain of melancholy, the sense that what calls most sweetly from beyond the road home may be lovely precisely because it cannot be kept without sorrow. Now, after all the old warnings, it is possible to return to the sound itself and hear it more gently, not as a threat waiting in the dark, and not only as an invitation to be refused, but as something tenderer and more human in its effect upon the heart. Fairy music in so many tellings is not memorable because it is loud or strange. It is memorable because it is lovely in a way that almost aches. It arrives faintly over the moonlit hills, thinned by mist, softened by distance, and already touched by absence before the listener has even begun to understand it. One can imagine standing still on the road home, not stepping away, not answering, only listening while the tune drifts and fades and returns again. In such a moment the sorrow inside the enchantment becomes clearer than the danger. The music seems less like a command than like a sadness passing through the night in beautiful form. There's a kind of beauty that gladdens the heart, and another kind that hushes it. Fairy music belongs to the second kind. Its sweetness is never entirely free of melancholy. Even when it is graceful, even when it seems to shimmer with hidden brightness, there remains within it some quieter note that suggests loss, distance, or the memory of something never fully possessed. This is one reason it lingers so powerfully in the imagination. It does not offer simple delight. It offers delight shadowed by yearning. The tune feels complete in itself, yet it leaves the listener aware of incompletion in his own life. It seems to come from a place where beauty has been refined beyond all roughness, and that very perfection makes the mortal heart feel its own limits more keenly. The sadness is not separate from the enchantment. It is part of what makes the enchantment so beautiful. Without that undertone of longing, the song would be merely pleasant. With it, it becomes haunting in the gentlest possible way. Distance deepens this feeling. The music is almost never imagined as near enough to be simply enjoyed and known. It remains just beyond reach, across the field, behind the hill, within the hidden chamber of the mound, or somewhere farther still, where no footpath honestly leads. That unreachability is essential to its character. What we cannot wholly approach often becomes more radiant in the mind, not less. The distant tune gathers beauty from its refusal to come fully into the open. It is shaped by the same quality that belongs to moonlight on bog water, or mist lying in a hollow before dawn, visible but not graspable, intimate yet set apart. In the old stories, this distance is part of the pain and part of the mercy. If the hidden music came entirely into the human world, it might lose the very grace that makes it what it is. Instead, it remains remote, and because it remains remote, it can be loved in imagination and grieved in the same breath. It is not ours, and that is why it moves us. This is how enchantment can wound without any violence at all. It does not need to strike, seize, or destroy. It only needs to awaken the heart to something it cannot safely keep. A person may hear such music and return home unharmed, and yet still carry with him a faint ache, as though the night had shown him a form of beauty that ordinary life could echo but never quite contain. There is no cruelty in that, and yet there is pain. It is the pain of limits, of mortality, of being bound to roads, doors, duties, mornings and endings while glimpsing for a moment something that seemed free of all those constraints. The old folklore understands this delicate sorrow. It knows that the deepest hurts are not always brutal. Some come softly, some arrive as music. Some leave behind not fear but wistfulness, a hush in the spirit, a tenderness toward the world made sharper by the knowledge that every lovely thing must remain partly beyond possession. And perhaps that is the gentlest wisdom the stories offer in the end, that beauty does not always need to be followed in order to be felt fully. The music on the wind can be enough as it is. It can be heard, admired, wondered at, and allowed to pass through the heart without pursuit. There is a quiet maturity in that old restraint, but also a quiet peace. The listener standing on the road home need not reject the enchantment. He need only let it remain where it belongs, among the hidden places, in the folds of the hills, beneath the moon, within the distance that gives it shape. Then the song becomes not a trap, but a visitation, not a road away from life, but a reminder that life itself contains mystery enough, if one does not demand to possess every sweetness that appears at its edge. To witness beauty and let it go may be sad, but it is also restful. It leaves the heart moved, not lost. So the tune may drift on in the Irish night, as faint as mist and nearly as soft, while the human world gathers itself again around simpler comforts. The road home still lies pale beneath the moon. The gate remains where it has always been. Far off, a window may hold one small square of candlelight against the dark. The hills keep their secrets. The hidden places remain hidden, and the listener, having heard enough, can turn gently back toward the faithful world of hearth, roof, familiar walls and sleep, carrying not the need to follow, but only the hush that beautiful things sometimes leave behind when they are allowed to remain distant. At last, the music begins to recede. It does not stop all at once, nor break like a thread pulled sharply apart. It simply grows fainter, as if the night itself were drawing it back into the hills that first released it. The tune thins over the fields, mingles with mist, and becomes once more part of the distance from which it came. What had seemed for a moment so near, so delicately urgent, now settles beyond reach again, behind the mound, beyond the dark shoulder of the hill, somewhere among the hidden places that keep their own silence. And as the sound withdraws, the heart need not follow. It can listen once more, softly, and then let the last notes drift where they belong, leaving only stillness and the pale, gentle light of the moon on the land. With the fading of the song, the road comes back into itself. The path underfoot feels plain again, faithful in its narrow course between hedge and field. The gate is only a gate now, its latch cool beneath the hand, its purpose simple and human. The lane no longer hints at secret turnings, but leads where it always meant to lead. Stone walls gather their familiar lines. The grass at the roadside gleams with dew. The fields lie quiet in their proper places, and the old boundaries, softened earlier by enchantment and mist, return with enough clarity to guide rather than trouble. There is comfort in this plainness. After all the distant sweetness of hidden music, the known world has its own gentler grace, the firmness of the path, the honest shape of the road home, the relief of not having to wonder what lies beyond the next dark rise. And then, little by little, the human world restores its warmth. One imagines the cottage ahead, perhaps not yet visible, but near enough now to be felt, a low roof under moonlight, a door that opens inward, a hearth banked for the night, the lingering scent of peat smoke and quiet shelter. Whatever waits there is modest, but it is enough. A chair by the fire, familiar walls, a bed turned down, the small mercies of earthly life, so easily dimmed in the presence of enchantment, begin to glow again with their proper value. Home is not bright with fairy radiance, nor filled with unending song. It asks for care and gives comfort in return. It belongs to time, to rest, to mourning, to the simple rhythm of a mortal life. And after the strange beauty of the hidden world has passed over the hills, those ordinary things feel not lesser, but dearer. Perhaps that is the deepest wisdom the old stories tried to keep alive. Not that beauty should be feared, but that it should not always be followed. To hear something lovely in the dark and remain upon the road is not a failure of wonder. It is a form of faithfulness. It is the quiet strength of knowing where one belongs, and of understanding that some mysteries are best left undisturbed in the places that hold them. The hills may keep their music, the mounds may keep their hidden brightness. The night may go on breathing its old secrets into mist and moonlight, but the human heart, having listened, may still choose the gate, the lane, the hearth, the known room waiting at the end of the road. There is tenderness in that choice, there is safety in it, and also peace. So now the enchanted distance can soften fully into rest. The music has faded, the road is steady, the cottage is near, the hills stand quiet beneath the moon, holding their hidden life without asking anything more of you tonight, and you may let the Irish night grow still around you, not as a place of calling now, but as a place of shelter, where the last of the mist lies low in the fields. The old warnings have done their gentle work, and the faithful world of home receives you back with enough warmth for sleep. The moonlit hills are waiting now exactly as they were before the first note ever wandered over them, pale under the quiet sky, folded in mist, older than the road, older than the gate, older than any listening heart. Somewhere among those distant rises the song may still remain, thin as silver wind, soft as water moving through grass, too far away to trouble the stillness that has gathered around you. It does not need to come nearer. It does not need to be followed. Let it stay where such music belongs, in the hidden places, in the deep folds of the hills, in the beautiful distance that gives it its mystery. Let it fade and return and fade again, as far-off things do in dreams, until it is less attuned than a hush resting lightly on the land. And here, apart from it, is the gentler world of human rest. The road home has already done its faithful work. The threshold has been crossed. The known and kindly things are near. Roof, wall, hearth, stillness, the soft enclosure of night kept safely outside the door. Hidden beauty may remain in the hills, and it loses nothing by remaining there. It can be lovely without being yours to seek. It can be real within the old imagination, and still stay far beyond the reach of your hands. There is peace in that distance. There is peace in letting mystery remain whole. The song can belong to the hollow places, to the moonlit mounds, to the silence beyond the last field. You belong to warmth, to quiet, to the slow and ordinary mercy of sleep. So the night becomes still again. The mist lies low in the grass. The trees keep their dark shapes without motion. The road has fallen silent. No footstep hurries along it now. No gate opens. No one is being called away. The hills hold their own secrets, and the fields rest under their veil of pale light. If the faintest music lingers, it lingers only as part of the distance, as soft and unreachable as moonlight on bog water, as harmless now as a memory half dreamed and already drifting farther off. The land settles, the air settles, the listening heart settles too. Everything that needed to be followed has already led where it should, back to safety, back to stillness, back to the simple human peace of lying down and letting the world grow quiet. And so, let the song remain in the hills. Let the hidden places keep their beauty. Let the moon shine over them without asking more. Let the old road sleep beneath its silver light, and let the mist rest in the hollows until morning. You do not need to go farther. You do not need to wander any more tonight. The distant music can stay distant. The enchanted world can stay closed and gentle and far away. Here there is only calm, and the soft dark and the slow easing of thought into rest. Here there is only the fading of the hills into dream, the fading of the song into silence, the fading of silence into sleep.